The Angry Birds Movie 2 is noted to be something of a black sheep among sequels of its kind, because it's one of the few times a follow-up to an animated children's movie that was seen as average at best was actually considered an improvement over the original. Though, as I went on at length about in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, the Angry Birds movie isn't even all that bad when you really stop and look at it. But the point is that the Angry Birds Movie 2 actually builds on the concepts presented by the first movie in surprisingly effective ways, and much better than a sequel like Ralph Breaks the Internet. Because unlike that film, the setup for Red's issues in the second movie was already present in the first one and were something that should have been explored. And today, I'd like to take a look at how both the Angry Birds Movie 2 and Ralph Breaks the Internet handle having main characters with insecurity issues and specifically explain why it was done way better in Red's case. And obviously there will be spoilers for both sequels, as well as their original movies ahead. So in case you haven't seen any of those yet and don't want to know how they end, you should probably come back to this video another day. Okay, so if you're a frequent watcher of my channel, you'll know that I'm not a big fan of Ralph Breaks the Internet and tear into the movie constantly, even arguing that it was actually worse than Cars 2 in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to. But the thing is, I'm only so hard on it because it's genuinely that bad. As a writer myself, I am just consistently baffled that professional screenwriters could have screwed up a sequel to a movie as good as the original Wreck-It Ralph so badly. And one of the worst offenders in this department is the main character himself, Wreck-It Ralph. Because in the original movie, Ralph is an everyman with a bit of a temper, but nonetheless a nice guy at heart who simply wants the respect he rightfully deserves but doesn't get. In other words, Ralph's just a normal person who's tired of being treated like a criminal simply for doing his job. So he sets out to learn what being a hero is really all about, and even gets the chance to be one, finally earning him the respect he so desperately craves. And it's all done so well that the movie actually has a pretty emotional ending because of it. But then in the sequel, he's suddenly turned into a clingy, insecure moron who leans on Vanellope and her approval like a crutch, and goes to unhealthy and obsessive means to ensure that she doesn't leave him. And not only is that unintentionally creepy, considering the age difference between them, but that is simply not the same character from the first movie. Ralph didn't go out looking for a friend who would give him self-worth. He just wanted to be treated as an equal, so there's no foundation for the character he becomes here. Ralph was a very nice and considerate guy. If anything, he would have tried to help Vanellope live her dreams instead of trying to sabotage her because he was that desperate for a friend. He already has plenty of friends. And as I've said in many other videos, he would never have been stupid or selfish enough to actually buy and plant a virus inside a game. The only way he ever would have done that was as a last resort to stop an evil threat. And as I just said, the Wreck-It Ralph from the first movie and the one in the sequel are simply not the same character. Because in the original, he was never shown to have insecurities or obsessive tendencies. So to have them suddenly brought to the forefront in Ralph Breaks the Internet comes completely out of left field, and moreover only takes away from the movie because he then has to learn a lesson he never needed to. Now just compare that to Red in the Angry Birds movie. Because here we see that Red was an orphan who was born with an angry streak and spent his entire childhood being bullied and rejected by everyone. So as a result, in adulthood, he's extremely grumpy and pushes everyone away so they won't hurt him, but secretly wishes he could fit in with the rest of society. And then he suddenly finds purpose and acceptance when everybody turns to him after the pigs steal their eggs, because he was the only one that was suspicious of them, and rises to the challenge by doing what he does best, getting angry, and uses that to save the children. Then at the end, he's hailed as a hero and finally gets the acceptance and friends he had secretly wanted all along, ending things on a triumphant note for him. Then in the sequel, we see that he's continued foiling all of the pigs' attempts to return to the island and reclaim their eggs, and is very happy to finally have a purpose. But then when a bigger threat than both of them arises, Red suddenly finds himself weary of the situation, because he's afraid that if the conflict between the birds and pigs stops, he won't be seen as a hero anymore and everybody will reject him once again. And considering his upbringing and not exactly ideal existence he led in the first movie, that's a completely understandable fear, even if he doesn't end up coping with it in the best way. Because his solution to the problem is to assure everyone that everything is under control and that he can handle it, which ends up coming back to bite him when Zeta orders an attack on their island, that's still inhabited specifically because he told them not to evacuate. And when Zeta calls him out on that, all he can do is hang his head in shame, realizing that his short-sightedness and need to be seen as a hero could end up costing the lives of everybody he cares about. But rather than fall into depression, he decides to own up to his mistakes and set things right, while also now being willing to share the glory with everybody who deserves it. Because that's what being a true hero is really all about. Now, the most obvious difference to point out between these two characters is that Red actually has a precedence for how he behaves in the sequel. The first movie shows how saving the eggs gave him a purpose in life, so it's only logical that the sequel would show what would happen when that purpose is challenged, and how his fears of being left alone and unloved again cause him to think irrationally. And not only do these issues carry over from the first movie, but are also handled in a way that keeps him sympathetic. Because not only are his fears understandable given his upbringing, but he doesn't do anything outright stupid. Like when he says they shouldn't evacuate the island, a competent leader would have probably been on the safe side. But it's not like he knew something horrible was going to happen if they didn't. And on top of that, it's also made obvious that he's not thinking clearly because he's afraid of being an outcast again, which makes it more understandable that he might not give the best advice. But once again, while evacuating would have definitely been a good idea, at that point it didn't look like not doing so would be a death sentence based off the information he had. And there's also that his need to be a hero doesn't come from him trying to satisfy his ego or because he's extremely vain and revels in all the awards it gives him. He only wants to continue being seen as a hero because it gives him the acceptance and love that he was denied all his life. So it makes sense that he would not only continue to try and be one by any means necessary, but also be afraid of what would happen if his island didn't need him anymore or stopped seeing him as one. To put it simply, it's clear from the very start of the first movie that Red has some issues to work out. And the sequel not only builds on those issues in all the right ways, but does it so that the audience can still understand where he's coming from, even when he starts making poor choices. Because even if his problems start dictating his actions, it's still presented in a way that keeps him sympathetic to the audience, because his mistakes and fears are completely understandable and relatable ones. Now, just contrast all of that with Wreck-It Ralph. Because as I explained before, there is nothing in the original movie that hints at him having insecurity issues or being desperate for friends. So the fact that the sequel makes that the whole crux of his character is already a strike against it. But then they also give him a major IQ downgrade by having him make stupid decision after stupid decision simply to move the plot along until he plants the virus and slaughter race to make Vanellope lose interest in the game. Which, as I already said, is something he would have never done. Now, it is true that the narrative does frame him as being in the wrong for this, but the problem is that the audience knows that Ralph knows better than that. Again, with Red in the Angry Birds movie 2, it's not only understandable why he makes mistakes, but moreover, they're mistakes the audience could see him making based off his behavior in the first movie. His fears of going back to being an outcast are built off of what we see of him in the original. While in Ralph Breaks the Internet, every bad or stupid thing that Ralph does is simply because the writers say so, rather than because they're built on any precedents. And that's not how one writes character progression. Again, Ralph never needed to learn to let go of his friends or insecurities. So the fact that the movie tries to sell the audience on the fact that he does only makes it extremely frustrating to sit through. Especially because it's not even told in a compelling or sympathetic way, unlike with Red. Now, don't get me wrong. What the writers had in mind for Ralph's character in Ralph Breaks the Internet could have worked. The problem mainly lies both in that they decided to explore issues that Ralph never even had, but also went about it all wrong, making both him and Vanellope out to be extremely unlikable and stupid. So as a result, any message the movie attempts to send ends up falling flat, because it's not delivered all that effectively. Since not only is Ralph forced to learn a lesson to a problem that he never even remotely hinted to have had in the first movie, but is also turned into the dumbest and most unpleasant version of himself, the results are something more akin to character assassination rather than character progression. And if they were really set on telling a story with him like that, it should have been a lot closer to what was done with Red in the Angry Birds movie 2. Because not only are his issues explored in a compelling way that keeps him sympathetic and his actions understandable, but also builds off of what was set up in the original movie rather than having to invent his problems for the sequel to tell a story with him that shouldn't have been told. In other words, one respects what the first movie did and works with what it had set up, while the other was more interested in continuing the story how it wanted to, and suffered immensely for it as a result. Which is only one of many reasons why a lot of people would argue that the Angry Birds movie 2 is a much better sequel overall than Ralph Breaks the Internet. One perfectly understands its main character and how his story should continue, while the other tried to mold him into somebody else and destroyed his character in the process. Okay, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now why don't all of you tell me? Do you believe that the Angry Birds movie 2's handling of Red's insecurity issues and need for friends was done much better than Ralph's were in Ralph Breaks the Internet? Or do you believe the Disney movie is actually the superior film? Please feel free to let me know in the comments. And as I always say, you do not have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You can feel about both the Angry Birds movie 2 and Ralph Breaks the Internet however you'd like. And if you think I had it all wrong, that is perfectly okay. And thank you all for watching. It is all very much appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.